Now, I know lawyers get a bad rap, and I know lawyers in work have got a pretty bad rap so far. I am introducing you to Andrew Douglas, who is one of my favourite lawyers. He's from FCW, and you're the managing principal. Um, Andrew's going to take you guys through management action and some of the nuances and some of the core components that you need to really be across and think about if you're looking to utilise that as a defence when you're chatting to your agent.
All right. So my subject's reasonable management action. I will confess that Kim didn't settle these slides. I actually did them late at night, and so they're filled with mistakes. And as we go through, I'll point them out so you can have a chuckle, okay? What I do want to say about reasonable management action is the world has changed a little bit and people haven't quite caught up. Now that we have positive duties around sexual harassment and discrimination, what is reasonable management action looks to the implementation of your positive duty, not just the actions that you take in managing someone. So, and we're about to get that with psychological hazards. So can I just explain that a little bit at the beginning so it makes sense? A positive duty is like a reverse onus. There is a requirement on you to eliminate sexual harassment and discrimination, and shortly, psychological hazards. That means you must have a demonstrable set of procedures that do that. You must have a governance structure that supervises that, and you must have an evidence collection regime that draws in the evidence around risk, okay? Now, none of you have that completely, okay? So it is something you're going to have to work on because more sophisticated plaintiffs, particularly after the psychological hazards legislation eventually lands with the codes and regs, are going to be challenging it. Now, that's nothing to be frightened of. Can I just, after saying it, I don't want you to go, oh, well, we're stuffed. The collection of evidence around hazards is the same type of evidence collection you do on a usual basis. For psychological hazard, it means a lot of what Simon's been chatting about, looking at HR reports around conflict, looking at exit interviews, having done surveys, looking at where those risks sit in a segmented way. When you see a level of risk or a red haze over one part of the organisation, doing some focus groups to draw down on it, looking at absenteeism. Does that make sense? Those give you a bit of a mud map of where risk is. And I think Simon has, in the time that I was here, has pushed regularly about the issue of empowering and building capabilities of supervisors and managers to report back observational changes in people's behaviour. Please don't go and buy the most expensive software, because when people don't use it, it's a breach of reasonably practicable. Do you understand that? If you have something which you say it's reasonably practicable to do, and you don't use it, then it's a per se breach under safety legislation. You don't get much dumber than that, do you? So can you start off with a minimum viable product, something very simple to capture that information, build up supervisor and manager skills, start training them around things like what is information I do record versus information I don't. So on simple privacy terms, if Kim tells me something about one of her kids struggling at school, but it doesn't affect her inherent requirements of the job, it's not something I can tell anyone else about, okay? It's both private and it is sensitive information, which I can't record. But if she tells me that it means she can't be on time every day, then it is a matter that is relevant and does go to the inherent requirements of the job. Does that make sense? But it's a bit of education, isn't it? Because what we want to do is have our staff engaging with their employees, because there's no other way we can pick up psychological hazards, is there? Because you can't stare at people to pick up well, you can create a psychological hazard by staring at someone long enough, but you can't learn much about it unless you see someone looking sad, they're looking isolated, their grooming has dropped off. They're all the sort of things that do warn you that psychological health problems are emerging. But the best thing is talking. So if we're going to talk about how we manage reasonable management actions, the first thing is having a proper engagement model between our supervisors and staff, okay? The second thing that is the most important thing when we're dealing with reasonable management action is actually having job descriptions that are accurate. Does that make sense? Because if I'm asking someone to do their job and it is their job and they don't like it and I do it the right way, it's reasonable management action. If I tell them to do their job and it's not the document that describes their job, it is not reasonable management action. And yet all our job descriptions have 2007 iteration 4 to be reviewed in 2008. Bit late now. Okay? Please don't fall foul of the Nong who says job descriptions should be just high principles. If you hear someone say that, you're allowed to hit them across the chops for me. It is meant to describe their job. And yes, workplace is more volatile, so changes occur more often. That means you review your job description in consultation with the person, because remember, a job description is a carve-up of organisation capability. Okay? When you put the pieces together, that is the total capability the organisation needs to do their job. So if we don't have good job descriptions, it's likely we have more people than we need doing the jobs, because we're tolerating people working at 50%, we're tolerating badly behaved people. We're not using the job descriptions as they're meant to do, which is a window into truth. Okay? Last thing, please, whenever you're dealing with people, the people who are managing them should have in their toolbox the relevant policies and procedures that relate to managing people. They include work orders, SWIMs under some circumstances, all policies and procedures that relate to people. If your supervisors don't know that, you can absolutely be assured you will not have a defence of reasonable management action before the Victorian regulator. Okay? Good. Now let's see what happens when I turn this on. Yeah, can I just say these are from another presentation. Now, I did this, Kim. This is me, all right? I just want to put my hand up. These have nothing to do with what we're talking about today, which is why you should not let me loose on a laptop, okay? But the first two are actually quite good, because they were for today. Reasonable management action means it is fair to take a management action and you do it in a fair way. The Victorian regulator, for all its perversions, and there are many, we don't have a Victorian regulator along today before I get into too much trouble, do we? After the ombuds, beg your pardon? Hi. Kim told me to say this. The Victorian regulator, after being perverted by the Ombudsman, changed the method of acceptance of claims, which had to do with policy, not law. The current legislation would reject claims correctly. The suggested new regulations is an absolute nonsense. Stress has never been a basis upon which a claim can be accepted. Okay? It has to be a psychological injury. Can I just say, Safe Work Australia has just released a whole lot of information about where claims are coming from, and the really large claims still are sexual harassment and bullying. So can I just say the frontline attack is on conduct. We'll deal with stress as we get through it, but let's just stop the really bad conduct that's occurring and move through it, okay? Not start at the bottom, have I written out my instruction clearly? Let's stop the egregiously bad stuff to begin with, okay? And the problem is you don't, because they are our red flag characters who circle out there and have been there for 10 years, and everybody knows who they are, everybody hates them, they hurt people on a regular basis, and it's permitted. That's failing to actually manage people, okay? And they are the ones who win the claims, because you're so sensitised to dealing with these people that when the opportunity comes up, somebody eventually cracks and goes, let's sack them, and everything falls apart, okay? So the two tests are, was it fair to discipline them or to manage them? And did you do it in a fair way? We're going to spend quite a bit of time on the fair way, because we always know when it's fair to discipline people, don't we? When they fail to comply with the values and purpose of the organisation, when they breach a policy and procedure, when they fail to fulfil their role as their job description. It doesn't get any easier, does it? All right. Victorian regulator, as I've said, doesn't apply the proper bullying test, okay? The bullying test that's used in the Fair Work Act, which has the same defence, reasonable management action. And what this case says is this: in the Fair Work Commission, it is expected that reasonable management action is done in a robust manner, that there's room to fail. The bottom line, was it fair to do it, and did you do it in a fair way? It's not interested in policies and procedures. It's not interested in perfection. It's interested in you saying to someone, we observed you do this. This is what it breaches. Is there a reason why you did it? Okay, I'm going to do something about that. There's no need for people to be present during investigations, support people. None of that stuff exists in the Fair Work Commission. But let me tell you, it does in the workers' comp jurisdiction. Okay, so I want you to understand what the test is in the Fair Work has nothing to do with what you're dealing with. Okay? And from this moment on, we're going to be talking about what happens here and what you have to do and what is deemed to be fair. Okay? And now ignore 3, 4, 5 and 6. Here we go. Red flag employees. Simon's talked a bit about profiling. And to help Simon along the path, can you not write down any of that information you collect? Because that would be a protected attribute and a breach of privacy, and Simon would be going to jail along with the rest of you, okay? So good to know, and when you're talking about someone, you can see the different gradations of risk with them, can't you? Yeah? Unfortunately, as the return to work person, you're like a pathologist. It's all happened by the time it gets to you. All the damage has been done, okay? So this discussion is about getting ahead of the game. The reality is for the matters, and I can only talk for Kim because she runs our workers' comp practice. I sit in a different part, but used to do what she does, not as well, is nearly every accepted claim I saw along psychological risk factors was predictable 6 months before it happened. It was like a plane coming into land, and nobody did anything about it. So what's the best educative tool we can do is we can start speaking to operations and saying, when I see someone's productivity drop off, when I see their behaviour veering towards being disrespectful, distant, disengaged, when I understand they're starting to engage other people in negative behaviour, I know they're all the red flags. They are absolute red flags towards a site claim going in from this type of employee. I'm not talking about the general employees, because there are people who are vulnerable and they come to work and work breaks them, okay? My first line of protection should work there, shouldn't it? Supervisors should be engaging and chatting to people, and when they realise someone's having a family breakup, have the conversation with them, say, how's it going? Is it impacting your work? What can I do to assist? And sending up the alarms to make sure that person is protected and bring in the people to care for them. Strangely, and I think it might not just be me, work for me is a place I go to relax. It's an escape from home when you've got 5 children, you know, it's an escape. I like being at work. Nearly everyone does, okay? So when people stop liking being at work, there is a reason, isn't there? And we actually need to step behind people at those circumstances, because work is a safe place for them. So I want you to think about performance and conduct, because they are the triggers. And what I want is discussions starting to happen with supervisors and managers and saying, and we do this on a weekly basis in our business, where the person who's in charge of an area has individual discussions with each employee and one group discussion, which talks about allocation of work, what's happening for the day, but is actually a general positive conversation with the person about them. Now, that's not hard, is it? Because we sort of do it in an indirect way. But by requiring it to be done, what it means is you have a structured collection of evidence around risk. You see people change. Now, whether we like it or not, 1 in 4 of us in this room is going to be unable to do the inherent requirements of the job this year for a period of time, because that's just the evidence, okay? So this isn't something that's a low risk issue, is it? If we look at risk as a measurement of frequency and consequence, I think you'd all agree with me, mental health would be one of our highest risks in our workplace. And it's 4 times the cost of the average standard claim when it goes in. 20% of people never return from the day they put in the claim. This is the recent evidence that's coming through. So shouldn't we be putting some resources into this? Yeah? We're about to get a positive duty. What do you think the positive duty requires? Just what I said. First, the initial collection of evidence, then the empowering of supervisors to start engaging in this communication, capture of evidence, and intervention when people cease to be able to do the inherent requirements of their job. Okay? Does that make sense? It's not you guys. You guys are collecting the bag at the end of the day. It's not a great bag to collect, okay? There's a rule in reasonable management action which says a mere blemish doesn't spoil reasonable management action. Okay, now I repeat this heading later, but it's irrelevant. This time it is relevant, okay? As I've said, industrial courts like the Queensland Court apply this on a regular basis, because the Industrial Relations Commission deals with workers' compensation on appeal in Queensland, but not here. One of the major risks in any investigative process is to present somebody with something which is not what someone said or is not factually right, okay? Can I just say that blows? That's not a mere taint. That completely blows reasonable management action. And yet it is a very common behaviour to put to someone, look, you haven't been in on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I hear you were down the street on Thursday and da-da-da. And 2 or 3 bits of those are completely wrong. And you're saying, look, Jenny saw that and Fred saw that. At that stage, you've blown reasonable management action. Okay? So the part underneath this, which comes next, which is Wilkinson, talks about you've got to do due diligence before you start a process in relation to managing a person. Now, isn't this just absolute nonsense? We're trying to manage a person day to day and we've got to do due diligence on it. But nonetheless, that's what the courts say. Do you start to see how weird our workers' comp regime is? So what it says is, if I'm unhappy with the way that Simon's behaving, I've got to sit down and go, before I speak to Simon, I'm going to have to check to make sure that my concerns are valid. Oh, that's okay, isn't it? Yeah? I'm going to have to document it and check it against the people who've told me to make sure that that's all right. It's around about 11:30 in the day, and what Simon did was be rude to someone at 9. I think I've missed my opportunity. But that's exactly what is expected, for you to have absolute precision about what you put and be satisfied it is correct. You're not misrepresenting what other people said, and you're right about what you are, say, to the ability you can be. Now, if you think about processes of managing people, how often do you find those processes wrong because people just haven't spent the time? Okay? So again, can I just stop and say this? It's a red flag. It's coming towards you. You can see it. The plane's way away. It hasn't landed yet, but all the risks are shouting out to you. Stop and think. Get out your policies and procedure and create a tick list. Okay? I know this is dumb, but Kim and I still do it in our own practice. What are the obligations we have to comply with? Because the Victorian regulator says that if you make any mistake with a policy and procedure, it's not reasonable management action. That's nonsense too, by the way, but that's nonetheless what the case is. So get your tick list ready. Remember, the idea of any process is it moves rapidly, not slowly. The longer it takes, the more likely the person will go off on sick leave. The sick leave will turn into workers' compensation and you'll have an argument. So don't hang around, okay? But these two issues are really big and they repeatedly come out in the cases, okay? And there is very strong law that says a misrepresentation of a fact that you put to someone hurts that person, so it's not reasonable management action. A lack of diligence, not checking something before you put to someone, again, places them in an unfair position, okay? But let's get it right. I'm going to commence the process. I've got my tick list. I've gone through my policies and procedures. Next thing, what is the behaviour or conduct that I'm concerned about? What does that breach? So when you look at performance process, how often do people say that the following behaviour breached our value in that? Bang. It breached our policy of this in that it did. Why doesn't it do that? Because it's meant to, isn't it? Yeah? You're going to make findings of fact as to the behaviours that occurred. But due diligence requires you to put to the person, not at the disciplining stage, but at the very beginning, what is the wrong they have allegedly committed. Does that make sense? Now, if I look at what happens, the first thing I see when I look at files is the first one was done orally and there's a few notes taken afterwards. Shame on you. Okay, there's evidence law called contemporaneous evidence, which said notes created at the time of a discussion occurred and an email that follows it afterwards is contemporaneous evidence. It is admissible as the truth. It's what's called an exception to the hearsay rule. Why is it admissible to the truth? Because the learning paradigm that humans have is that what they observe in the first few minutes stays clean, but is quickly corrupted by being passed through sieves of experience and becomes their new reality. When people say people lie in court, it's a nice thing to say, but it's not that true. What people tell in court is their truth, but their truth 2 years later, vastly different than what they observed. And when you show them CCTV, they're almost stunned by it. So I don't want you starting a process that begins with let's go and have a chat. I want you starting a process with looking at the policy, what is required to do. It's going to be a counselling, if it's going to be counselling, or it's going to be what do I have to do? And from that moment, documenting the process I'm going to undertake. And when I speak to people, I keep a documentary trail of it. Next thing. Never speak to a person who's a red flag employee. And I'm sorry for using red flag as a pejorative term, but it's where about 80 to 90% of the accepted claims, site claims, come through. And remember, there's no reasonable management action for a physical claim. So we're only talking about psychological claims, and we're only talking about them in the performance paradigm. Never, ever, ever hand a letter to somebody saying, I'm going to investigate you. Okay? You say to that person, look, we need to have a chat to you. Bring a support person. I'm going to give you a letter. The letter sets out an allegation. Why? Because there's two absolutely crazy cases that say that's good law. It's shitful. It's not law at all, but it's workers' comp law, okay, which is Gumby stuff. Always in the letter, make sure you've identified the nature of support the person can have at 3 levels. EAP, external psychological support if you have it, and thirdly, a personal supervisor or manager that they can call at any time if they're confused. Your letters must have it in there. Why? Because it is contemporaneous evidence of what was said. At the beginning of all conversations, please write nicely to people. I don't want to see we refer to our meeting the 6th. I don't want any crap like that. I want to say, look, we're going to have a difficult conversation. I'm sorry about that. But these matters have come up and we need to discuss it. It's the same letter, isn't it? But when the Fair Work Commission, when the regulator sees it, when a federal court sees it, what do they say about you as an employer? Good people. The 1%ers in court are you being good rather than being powerful. So we take away our power, we strip it away, we unclothe it so that we're seen as the generous and kind person. So again, you say to a person very early on, I know this is distressing, you brought a support person along and I'm glad of that. We've got in the letter what support you can have during the process. Please feel free to take them. If you need to talk to anyone, give me a hoy. I'll put my mobile number in. Does any of that seem hard? Yet if I look at the letters I see, they're abrupt, rude, and basically say, it is alleged that bang, 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 rather than saying, there are a number of matters that have been raised. They're called allegations. I set out the allegations below. Demystify the process for people, okay? Because they think allegations is going to jail. That's how people review them, okay? Investigations. Not everything has to be an investigation. Can we start with that? If a person has done a minor breach, I don't have to appoint an investigator. If it's a minor breach, which is not an offence breach under safety law, or it's a low level, we can facilitate that process with the person's consent. Does that make sense? So what is the process? Low level stuff, active disrespect, and 3 meetings rolling their eyes at their boss, chatting to people while meetings are on. Unacceptable and quite difficult behaviour, but not terrible, okay? So you'd have the first thing of inviting them to something with a support person. You say, look, we've got a letter for you. These are the issues of concern we have. I don't want you to tell me your view on them now. Have a think about it. We think there's an option to meet with you and your manager to actually resolve some of this stuff because it looks interpersonal to us. But obviously, if that's not your choice, we can proceed to investigate formally. But I'll leave that with you, okay? If you're going to do a facilitation, remember facilitations aren't, what's your name? It's not Sue, bringing Sue and Travis, because he just happens to be sitting there into a room and saying, let's get this right, because Sue and Travis don't like each other. So that's just an amphitheatre where 2 warriors cut and slash. It's me having a meeting with Sue before, who's got concerns about the way Travis treats her. Me then having a separate meeting with Travis, who's got concerns about the way Sue's performing, where I calibrate how they're going to respond to each other and I find out what they need, okay? Now, for all of those who've got teenagers, the word sorry has many different meanings. But when I say sorry to you, it's actually not, okay? So Sue's not after sorry, nor is Travis. What they're after is a workable relationship of trust. So deal with them as adults, not children, okay? You see how easy some of this stuff is? That's called an intake. I find out what the problem is. I talk to Sue about what she expects the outcome to be. I recalibrate her expectations when they're unreasonable and say, no, Sue, Travis doesn't have to jump off a building. That's actually not part of the outcome we're looking for here. But a good result would look like this. Sue goes, yeah, look, I could live with that. Right. I can move on to the next conversation. Do not stick 2 people in a room who are at loggerheads. You'll get nothing good out of it except some forced apologies and a whole lot of resentment, which will bubble up later up. And by the way, putting them together is not reasonable management action. Okay? Particularly if they didn't ask for it. So if they do agree to it, please send them an email saying, look, thank you for agreeing to participate in this facilitated process. It does seem the best way through. Obviously, if it doesn't work, there are other options we can look at. But I will meet Travis on this date, Sue on this date, and then we'll meet together there. Anyone needs support, here's all the support. If you've got any confusion about the process, please let me know. Can you look at your policies and procedure and not make them prescriptive so they actually get in your road? So that we have these choices, informal processes. You can step them up. You can use external facilitators. You can use external investigators. Go back and find the people who like crossing T's and dotting I's haven't made it unworkable and inflexible, because we're dealing with people and flexibility is everything, isn't it? Some people respond better to some things than others. So don't be too prescriptive in what you do. If you are going to do an investigation, you're left with one very difficult question at the beginning. Do I just get what the complainant says, or if the complainant's vulnerable, we're allowed to utilise other legislation to put it as a business concern? Does that make sense? So if it's a safety issue, I can say, Sue doesn't want to be named as the complainant. She's quite scared about it. She's vulnerable. So what I say to Simon is, look, the firm is aware of the following concerns and the management and treatment of Sue. Okay? So you're not a complainant. It's best to have a complainant because it allows you to heal. Does that make sense? But if we need to protect Sue, there's an alternative. But the question after deciding how to put the allegation is, do I need to verify it before I go to put it to the person who is going to be the ultimate respondent? So the factors around that are, Sue's pretty distressed, I'm not getting a lot of detail. An allegation is an identification of a date, time, place, behaviour, comment. It's very precise. It's not a vibe. It's not a feeling. It's not rolled up, you've repeatedly done X, Y, and Z. It's not. It's got to be particular. But I'm struggling to get it from Sue because she's so distressed. Well, I'll say, Sue, did anyone else see it? Do you mind if I chat to them? I'll go and get it and I'll get more detail. Then I'll put an allegations letter and then I might have to come back and chat to people. But if Sue gives me really good detail, then what I can say to the respondent is, this is the complaint that has been made. See, I'm not misrepresenting. I'm not saying it's true. Yeah? I've done my due diligence. I've spent a couple of times with Sue. I've sent her the allegations letter for her to be comfortable before it goes out. Due diligence done, no misrepresentation. I'm on the road, aren't I? When I go to present that allegations letter, if this is not required by any other workplace law, then I'll say to Simon, because he's gone now, I can say this to him, Simon, can we catch up with you? This is not a disciplinary issue, but I'd welcome you bringing a support person with you. We've got a letter we need to provide to you and have a chat with you. Easy, isn't it? No complaint. There will be, but process very, very good. And at that time, I'd say, look, I don't want you to respond to this. This is a letter. It complains, a complaint, allegation, an investigative process. Have a read of it first and let's catch up tomorrow with your support person. I'll walk you through the process. Do you see there's no hurry, is there? But what do we try and do? We try and collapse everything into a very short period of time, and yet we know what happens to people's limbic system when they're challenged, don't we? We know the neuropsychology. At the moment you put an allegation to me, I can tell you, I'll fight you. Why? Because my brain just shuts down. I don't understand you're trying to help me. I feel you're attacking me. That's what happens when you get limbic overload. That's fight, flight. So what you're trying to show for reasonable management action is you're aware of that and you're giving people steps along the way to safely do it. Will they blow it out of the water? Will they not come into work the next day? Absolutely, okay? It doesn't matter. It's not our problem, it's their problem. Why are we making it our problem? Why are we worried someone's on sick leave? Half the bloody office is on sick leave. Why are we worried about it? We've been through COVID where everyone was sick. And yet we're worried about someone taking a sick day. Just tell everyone to take a chill pill, okay? We'll get there when we get there. In the investigative process, I won't go through this in detail because it's a conversation for another day. What I do want you to understand, you must impress on people confidentiality. They are not to speak to other people. They've got to know if they do, there's a risk to them, a disciplinary risk. Otherwise, we get them and us, don't we? We get two sides fighting and the office blows up and we get victimisation occurring. We must always put support in any letter that we do. When you do findings at the end of it, please make them factual findings rather than you were bullied, you did bully, you did sexually harass. That's for the decision maker, okay? That was the allegation, the original allegations letter. But the factual issues that are alleged are the ones that are findings made. From the moment you start doing findings, start doing the investigation, have identified the decision maker, quarantine them, don't let them know what's happening in the investigation. Because for all the things we've talked about today, there will be a whole lot of protected attributes that bubble up during that. I'm caring for children, I'm really tired. There'll be workplace rights. I don't feel safe in this interview. Do you see what I mean? All those things go to general protections claims and discrimination. And it is the subjective state of mind of the decision maker in general protections that is the issue. So if they're quarantined from all that stuff and just get findings, there is no general protections claim that's going to be successful. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, we're going through a bit of different law at the moment, but I want you to understand workers' comp doesn't sit alone, okay? We've got our findings and we've gone on to performance management and misconduct. Please be yourself. There is a temptation of people to speak in a deep, slow voice when they're giving someone bad feedback. You know, Kim, I'm very unhappy with what's happened. Just be yourself, because you actually have no control over your own mental health when you're being someone else, when you're being this serious little urchin who's trying to show. You're making sure the other person's in fight, flight, but worse than that you are, so you can't hear the person giving you an olive branch. So make sure you read out the disciplinary letter first. You explain who's present in the room. You explain everyone's jobs. Why? To get your breath, because good people really struggle doing this, because it hurts. Giving discipline to someone, for me, even 35 years in, and always been the person who does it, I still don't sleep well the night before. I'm still stressed. I'm still trying to speed it up to get it over and done with. Just slow down, be yourself. If you're a naturally funny sort of person, you know, say, look, be comfortable, have a smile on your face. Admit what it is for them. Look, I'm sorry you found yourself in this situation. It's difficult, I know. We're going to make the process be like this. Always explain the process. I'm going to read this through so you can hear it. Then we'll go back and deal with each point as we go. Your support person's there as an emotional support. Please don't speak during it unless you observe that Sue is distressed and you want to provide them with support. Your job's not an advocate. If they're a union rep, then say to them, look, it's really important I hear the evidence from Sue, not you, so please don't tell me the evidence. It's Sue's response that's critical. Happy for your supporter, happy for you to make representations on her behalf, but the response to the question comes from her, not you, because that's the person who has to respond, okay? Does that all make sense? Really straightforward, really simple. Just be you, don't be anybody else. Always have someone present who's taking notes. By the way, the note-taking, I don't want you to do it verbatim because it doesn't work. And I really don't want you sitting there with the computer going, because there's nothing like telling somebody something sensitive just to hear computers being tapped next to your head. That makes me feel very good and respected. So taking notes, and what I want you to do is catch phrases in response, the use of the person's language, okay? There's no way I would have done that. Well, right, there's no way I would have done it. Why? Because if we're going to end up in court, if you've captured that language, the authenticity of your notes will be accepted, because they'll hear the person give evidence, they'll see your notes and go, yeah, that's her, okay? But not everything, just the question and the response, okay? Letters and emails, contemporaneous evidence, tick. Generous, tick. No silly emails and letters, no rudeness, no overt formality. Kim does really beautiful letters where she says, look, thanks for our meeting. I have to raise with you a series of issues. I know they'll be distressing. They're called allegations. The allegations are below. Here's the support you can have. By the way, confidentiality, and saying confidentiality is very important. If you don't, there are really serious consequences. Yeah, you've got to put a bit of a punch in there because that's actually pretty important. They know it. But please make them nice. Unless you've been in court and had your own letter read out, you will not understand what it feels like. I've had my letters read out and I look like a thug. And that's partly because I'm a thug. You get to the end in performance managing and you've said, okay, I'm going to give you a first warning. Does everyone know what a warning is? A warning means that if you do this again, you'll lose your job. Or there'll be disciplinary consequences up to and including termination and appointing. Warning means I warn you, you are in trouble. If the warning doesn't appear in the letter that goes to the person and you don't say it, it's not a warning, okay? And therefore any reliance upon it is flawed, okay? You never warn someone unless you're going to put a plan in afterwards, do you? Has anyone tried that with a 5-year-old? Said, don't you ever, ever do that again, and then said nothing for 3 days. What happens? They quietly parade out and do it again. Why? Because the pressure's off. Now remember, kids do that and they love you. The people we're dealing with, I can tell you, don't love us. So whenever we decide to give a person a warning, whenever we decide to say to somebody we don't accept something, we've got to say what is good. So when you're counselling, you've heard me say this for those who've been unlucky enough to hear me before, counselling and discipline has a really simple way. You're observed, I saw, it is alleged you did this, it breaches it in this way. Is there a reason you did it? Listen, because maybe there's a good reason, okay? It is not to happen again, okay? That's the structure of any disciplinary or counselling meeting. And as a result of that, we go to the next part, which is, so let's work together to develop a plan to help you and give you the resources to prevent it happening again. Performance or conduct, it makes no difference. And on that performance plan, there must be down the bottom of it, please let us know whatever support or resources you need to act on this plan. We're committed to you achieving the plan, but we'll not know everything you need as support along the way to achieve it. Why am I saying that? I'm writing for somewhere else, aren't I? Because I write for another audience, and that's the Fair Work Commission, it's the federal court. I write. I also want the person to see it's genuine, so I'm going to back it up. But I am writing in the knowledge that if it goes wrong, the people who read it, whether it's the Victorian regulator or a court or tribunal, will go, gee, decent people. And that goes a long way, even with the Victorian regulator, to making a claim be rejected, if they see you have been repeatedly generous and kind on the way through. Yes.
What's up? I guess, have you seen situations where it's pretty clear the person giving discipline doesn't quite understand the warning, what it all means, the process?
Regularly, yeah, regularly known. Yeah.
And what's the implication there in terms of how successful?
So two parts to that. One is be aware that people are in fight flight. So you've got to satisfy yourself before the meeting is over that they do understand it. Otherwise, you come to the second part of it where it's clear that the person doesn't understand it, then the process is flawed. And it's really common to walk, I've done it because I get distressed. I've walked out of a meeting and not really heard anything the other person said, and they've walked out of the meeting and said the meeting was completely different to what I thought it was, and it's simply because we haven't heard each other. That's a neuropsychological problem, not a language problem. It's just fear and stress. So take time, slow things down, be satisfied. People do acknowledge. There will be mistakes that people make because they are upset. But if your notes are revealing that you've said, now look, you do understand this, yes. Okay, so what's your response to this? You'll be okay. Okay? Discipline, if we're dealing with a red flag employee, can you not go hard? Can you just do it one step beneath what you'd normally do? And there's a really good reason for that. We become incredibly sensitised to these characters. They really shit us. Sorry, that's on camera again, isn't it? And so when we get to a stage we are about to act, we overreact. Okay? Or you're presented with management saying, we want this person out. And you're going, well, you've been sitting there for 3 years doing nothing, and now you want them out. If we do that, we're dead. So try and wind people back. From the moment they say, this guy's really badly behaved, the first thing is, well, let's hear about the behaviour, but let's understand if there's been any condonation beforehand, this is going to be a difficult process. Now, condonation means you cannot punish that which you have permitted. Now, that's whether for Nguyen and I, whether I've let him come in late every day and now I go give him a first warning, or Sue and Nguyen come in late every day and I go to give Nguyen a warning and not Sue, I've condoned the misconduct. Does that make sense? I can't punish. With red flag employees, because people are scared of them, they've condoned lots of small misbehaviours over a long period of time, which have gradually grown in size to almost exotic behaviours that you'd never tolerate from anybody, including a wild dog. You let that person do. So when you come to punish them, you've got to start again. You've got to draw a new line and say, look, we've allowed this for a period of time. We've understood you're under a lot of stress, but from now on, please understand the following. You've got to reset. And the last thing is, please lock it in the chain of command, because people who are like this are inclined to have relationships all over the place, including people who are above you. And suddenly you'll find you're halfway through a process and there's someone very senior saying, what are you doing with Simon? Why are you doing that? He's got difficult problems at home. What do you think you're doing? And you're going, yeah, I know, but he's rude and he's... Well, that's not our Simon, of course, different Simon. You heard from Brendan, completely different Simon. Okay. All right, mere blemish rule just appears again just for a bit of fun. Just ignore that. Before you suspend somebody on pay, it's not called stand down. Stand down is under 425 of the Fair Work Act. That's for things like pandemics, okay, or for machinery failure. What you do is suspend someone on pay where they create a risk to someone else, or there is a risk generally created by their continued attendance at work, or whether they pose a risk to careful evidence collection. Their mere presence can interfere in the evidence collection, okay? Again, if you go to suspend someone, please make sure they've got someone with them, provide them with a letter and say, happy to talk about this more tomorrow. This is what we're doing and why. But we're very happy to talk to you more about it. We understand this comes as a shock, okay? Because people are inclined to just kick people out of a business. They're so quick to get rid of them and don't understand the level of risk. Okay, risk intervention process. Can you just, this is my sort of weird heading, which is before I start anything, I set up a matrix which goes nature of conduct, each piece down one side, and then I have another column that goes across the top, severity. And I do it just to remind myself that this is not a particular person, this is an issue, and I go and look at it carefully to make sure that my response is reasonable. And when I document it, it works, doesn't it? But when I deal with my heart, it's jumping out of my mouth, forming a conclusion that's not factual, okay? So it's my risk intervention process, because when I look at that, if there are high risks about the manner and the behaviour, I'm going to suspend the person, yeah? If it's medium to high, I've got some worries about how they're going to interact if they stay at work, but what I absolutely know is it's still going to be an investigative process, it's not going to be a facilitation. If the risks of the nature of the conduct are low, there's a potential of facilitation. Does that make sense? But until you look at it, you don't know. The other part is be very careful about your relationship to that person as the investigator, because that goes back to the due diligence process. If you are a person who could potentially have conflict, you're a person who's had run-ins with this person, you're the person's manager, for instance, you are not the person who should be doing the investigation, are you? Because you can't be a witness and an investigator at the same time and manage credibility issues, can you? Okay? So look for conflict, okay? And if it's there, even if a perception of conflict, make sure that person is not involved. That's part of all the risk intervention process. Can I just go back and say, reasonable management action, fair to do it, fair process. Under Victorian law, fair process means following your own policies and procedures and having absolute clarity about what is wrong, okay? Based on your own rules. It's not hard, but remember, we don't have a sophisticated tribunal that's going to enter in and have a more robust approach. If we don't do our tick list, if we don't get it right, if we're not generous and supportive at every level, if we're not offering support, if we're not giving the person a chance to make sensible decisions in it, it's got nothing to do with workplace law, it's got to do with workers' comp law, okay? Because there is no getting around what the regulator says, and it is the regulator who makes the decision, not the insurer, okay? Kim will probably deal with it later, but just one thing, when you come to insurer, please properly prepare a brief that shows the objective fairness of the contemporaneous evidence as you go through, so the insurer is seized with the best information. It's a fraught scheme where sometimes the rejection of the acceptance of a claim helps an insurer's profitability. So there is an internal conflict that sits inside insurers at times, plus their own relationship with the regulator. They're not going to move to your side of the fence unless what you are doing is fair and objectively reasonable. And on that last note, please do not seek to reject all claims. Only choose the ones that are truly worthy of rejection, because you are wasting your time and you are making sure that person never comes back to work at the same time. So it's Dumb and Dumber.